What is going on, guys? I'm Paul Ryan, your host of the Not the ATB show, fantasy show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. With me, as always, is the best co-host in the world, Dave PigskinPapers Hartman. Dave, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well on the Not ATB fantasy show. Happy to be here. We haven't done a show in a couple weeks, so I'm excited to get after it again. A lot, you miss a couple weeks in the NFL and a lot changes. And also for people who play fantasy football in most leagues, this is the last week before the playoffs. So an important week in the NFL and an important week for those who play fantasy football. How are you doing, Paul?
I'm doing well, sir. It's my favorite time of year. You know, you've got some important football going on. The weather's a little bit cooler here in Texas, so it gives you an excuse to wear hoodies and sweatpants, and it's just you kind of blend in with the crowd. You don't have to worry about being fashionable.
I know we mostly talk about NFL here, but are you a UT fan?
I wouldn't say I'm a UT fan. I mean, I always want my Texas teams to do good, so it's nice to see UT made the playoffs.
Yeah, they. I guess there's always controversy. I think the controversy though was more about Alabama versus Florida State than Texas. So anyway, one day maybe we'll do a college show, but I guess we should probably stick with the NFL tonight. Paul, why don't you remind people where they can find you on Twitter and what content you've got going on right now?
Yes, guys, I'm Paul Ryan. You can find me on Twitter at Paul_Ryan15. And right now, strictly doing the Cowboys stuff outside of doing this show. But every Monday, you can find our recap of the Cowboys game prior to the week before. And on Fridays, we have more often than not, we have a guest where we're going to be previewing and predicting the Cowboys matchup. And when we don't have a guest, we'll be previewing and predicting the Cowboys matchup. Just my co-host and I.
Got it. Okay. And I'm David Hartman. I'm at PigskinPapers on Twitter, and you can find my content there. In addition, you can find it on my website, thepigskinpapers.com. During the football season, I've mostly been putting up 2 articles a week, a waiver wire fantasy article that usually posts Monday or Tuesday, and then a fantasy preview, kind of a start sit. It's more than that, but it's got all your starts and sits and sleepers. That usually comes out Thursday morning, so I'll have my Week 14 preview out at some point, kind of middle of the day tomorrow.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, Dave, you mentioned it's been a while since you and I have recorded, and a lot has happened during that time. One thing I did miss talking about was all the injuries, Dave. And here I was thinking we might avoid talking about one this week. And then Monday Night Football happened, and Trevor Lawrence joined a long list of quarterbacks who have gotten hurt this year when he left in the fourth quarter with an ankle injury. If he doesn't start this week, only 7 of the 16 AFC teams will be rolling out their opening day starter. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Yeah, Paul, I don't think I have. And I was trying to think about why this might be happening, because the NFL has gone out of its way to adopt rule changes designed to protect quarterbacks. I mean, The NFL and the TV networks obviously don't want you watching Jake Browning and CJ Beathard in overtime. This coming week, they don't especially want you watching CJ Beathard and Joe Flacco at Jacksonville, at Cleveland. So they've tried to protect quarterbacks, but I think a couple of things have just kind of worked against that. Defensive players are bigger, stronger, faster, and even offensive linemen are bigger than they ever were. A lot of these injuries, and I think Lawrence's injury falls into this category. I can't remember exactly how the play looked, but, quarterbacks can get injured by their own offensive linemen. These 320-pound guys or bigger, getting blocked into the quarterback, and the quarterback's not really watching his own legs, and they get rolled into a lot. A lot of today's quarterbacks have been coached maybe improperly to hang on to the ball, try to scramble around, hang on to the ball as long as they can. There's more sacks this year than I think most years in the NFL. So I think it's a combination. I think more quarterbacks run, which can lead to injuries. But then, you look at Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins, I mean, they got injured on non-contact plays. So some of it may just be bad luck, but I can't remember. And last season had a lot of quarterback injuries too, but I can't remember a season where we had this many backup quarterbacks playing, and a lot of teams are on their third quarterback, so it's kind of crazy. Josh Dobbs has subbed for a starting quarterback on 2 different teams already this year. What about you? I mean, what do you think is going on with all these quarterback injuries?
Dave, I think you covered it perfectly. These injuries are so unpredictable. You mentioned Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins, those being non-contact injuries. And sometimes there's just freak accidents, again, like you mentioned with the lineman being rolled into a quarterback. We just saw an incident. A coworker was showing me an incident where Alvin Kamara got tackled out of bounds and he rolled over into a cameraman and snapped the cameraman's leg and can't snap the cameraman's leg. It's just, you can never predict what's going to happen in the NFL. But I thought you brought up an interesting point about quarterbacks maybe holding on to the ball too long and, leaving themselves open to being tackled, for defenders trying to make a play. I think that was an interesting point you brought up.
Yeah. It's, hopefully this is the end of it and we're not going to lose more quarterbacks down the stretch. And especially, most of the teams that are apparently headed to the playoffs seem to still have their starting quarterback upright. So hopefully that continues. But speaking of injury replacement quarterbacks, so Jake Browning, the Bengals, I think a lot of people had kind of left them for dead, and this was going to be a tough game for them to win at Jacksonville, who'd been playing very well. And Jake Browning went in there, had an amazing stat line, was zinging the ball, seemed to be smart enough to know that getting the ball to Jamar Chase is a good idea for him. And the Bengals came away with, kind of a thrilling overtime win. Are they still alive in the AFC? What do you think about them?
I saw a lot of people picking up Browning in Superflex leagues. I'm like, I didn't really know anything about the guy, but when I saw him being picked up, I'm like, man, I feel like people are wasting their fab on this guy. But, you look at it, back-to-back solid starts. The Bengals have a pretty solid, a good, not great defense and really good weapons on offense. Plus, Joe Mixon, he had a big game on Monday night. They're probably going to lean on him more. You call me crazy, but you look at the Steelers and the Browns, they both lose their starting quarterbacks. I think Cincy does have a chance to make the playoffs. What about you, Dave?
I think they have an outside chance. It's just very crowded in the AFC, and I'm convinced that the Bills will make the playoffs. I think of all the teams that are not division leaders in the AFC, the Bills are the best one. You look at a lot of metrics, and the Bills should not be 6-6. You look at like their point differential, you look at, where they rank offensively. I mean, I know they've had a lot of injuries on their defense, but, I think the AFC is going to be a mess. There's going to be like 6 or 7 teams fighting for 3 spots. And the Bengals certainly have a shot. I mean, what I think benefits them is they've been there the last 2 years. They've played a ton of big games. And they seem to rise to the occasion more often than not, like they did Monday night against Jacksonville. So I wouldn't write them off yet. I just think with so many teams fighting for just those 3 wild cards, and most of the division winners seem to have separated themselves to a degree. I mean, Jacksonville is now only a game up, but I think it's going to be hard for them, but I'm not writing them off. They're still alive.
Absolutely. Well, Monday night's game was definitely interesting, Dave. It was tied 5 different times, which is actually the most for any game this season. Was this the best primetime game so far this season?
It might have been. I went back and looked kind of through the schedule. I mean, there have been a lot of close games. First of all, we get at least 3 primetime games every week. In a couple of weeks, we've gotten more than that. But this was definitely one of the best ones. And actually, Seattle at Dallas on Thursday night, which is a game we'll get into, was maybe not as good of a game, maybe not as well played of a game, but was also a pretty exciting back and forth kind of, it kept looking like Dallas was putting them away and then Seattle would score again. So there have been a couple of other ones, but I think because the stakes were so high for the Bengals, and they've gone to the last two AFC championship games, including and a Super Bowl. You know, this was I think the most exciting and best primetime game we've had yet this year, but I think we'll probably get a better one in the next couple of weeks. Well, what about you? What did you think?
Dave, I was recording my Cowboys podcast, so I didn't actually get to watch the game. I was, some people in the chat were kind of keeping me up to date, and we tend to do a score update during the podcast just to, because we're recording on Monday nights, and all of us being football fans, we hate to miss the game, but I didn't realize that it had that many ties. I knew that it was a high scoring game, and when I was done with the podcast, I'm like, wow, this thing went into overtime. It was, got exciting. What really stood out to me the most, obviously, was the Trevor Lawrence injury. But I mean, hey, just I guess the biggest story for me was Jake Browning going toe to toe with Trevor Lawrence and him coming out on top. I thought that was the biggest storyline. But yeah, I mean, 5 different ties. I mean, this might have been the best primetime game. I mean, that's the Dallas Seattle was pretty good too on primetime, but I don't know if you consider that primetime or not.
Well, it was a night game in its own slot, 8 p.m. That's prime time. So I count the Thursday games, even though people seem to not like the Thursday games that much. But, I think that I think part of what was so good about Monday night's game is people didn't expect it to be a good game.
Yeah.
And Jacksonville went down and scored early in the game. They were up 7-0, I think. I think they scored the first points. But nobody would have been surprised if the Jaguars were up like 2 touchdowns in the second half. But Cincinnati just hung in there. They're a resilient team. You think about the AFC Championship game 2 years ago where the Chiefs were up big on them at the half. And that's obviously with Joe Burrow, which is a big difference maker, but they just came out and, found a way. So I think they're a good story, and I'm glad they're still involved. So we mentioned that Thursday night game, and we'll move now to one of my favorite segments of the show, the Our Team Talk, where we talk about you're a Cowboys fan, I'm a Dolphins fan, and it's funny because they're sort of similar teams right now. They've both been hot lately, but I think you could kind of say they've both been beating up on lesser competition for a lot of the season. I mean, it's sort of funny. They played the Commanders in consecutive weeks, and they both put up 45 on them and blew them out. So they're both 9-3, and they've both been feasting on the easier part of their schedule, and both of their schedules are about to get harder, sort of towards the end. But in any case, Dallas took care of Seattle on Thursday night, but it was a closer game than, a lot of Cowboy games have been this year, and especially their home games. I think it was their first home game that they didn't win by more than 20 points this season, which is pretty amazing. But they've just been, you think back to some of the home games they've had, they've just been annihilating other teams. And it looked like, DK Metcalf had a huge game. They were clearly picking on Deron Bland, who has all those pick sixes, and he got an interception in this game, but they were clearly going after him. And they clearly saw stuff on film where they thought that was a matchup they could go after. So you got the win, but any concerns with how Dallas's defense played in that game and how Seattle chose to attack them?
No, Dave, I mean, you think about it, every year the Cowboys, because they play on Thanksgiving, they played 3 games in 11 days, and that was the case. Dallas was playing its 3rd game in 11 days, and fatigue was bound to kick in at some point. And, we know the Seahawks offense was due for a big game, and what was a big difference maker apparently there on Thursday night was they got their starting right guard, Anthony Bradford, back, and he hadn't been playing since week 1. So Seattle actually had its starting 5 offensive linemen playing for the first time altogether since week 1, I believe. And, we saw how much of a difference that made for them.
Yeah, you raise a good point about the fatigue, and people forget that, that Dallas and Detroit in particular, usually have a kind of a crazy schedule around Thanksgiving. So, yeah, I mean, I thought it was an exciting game. I agree. I mean, Seattle needed the game more than Dallas did. and they threw everything they had at Dallas, and Dallas was able to come away. They scored 41 points. I mean, their offense right now just looks kind of unstoppable much of the time. So I think your team's in a pretty good place.
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about them, man. And Dave, you mentioned Dallas and Miami have a lot of similarities, and like you mentioned, they both beat up on weak teams. You look at the Dolphins; they're 0-3 against teams with winning records and 9-0 against everyone else they played. They faced the Titans and Jets at home in their next two, and then they have a gauntlet of home games with Dallas, at Baltimore, and at home versus Buffalo to finish the season. So their next three are at home where they haven't lost, and they only have one more road game. Can they get the number one seed, or will they lose harder game, or will those harder games derail them?
I think there's a path for them to get the one seed. I've always thought that it would be the Ravens or the Chiefs. I've kind of thought that for a while now, and I would still favor the Ravens, and I think that game in Baltimore in Week 17 will be obviously, if going into that week, the Dolphins and Ravens have the same record and are still kind of have the two best records in the conference, then obviously that game is huge and will probably decide the one seed. I mean, I think the Ravens are better. I think they're a more balanced team than Miami. And look, until Miami beats some good teams, I can't get too excited. I mean, you look at the teams they've beaten, and you can only play the schedule you have.
Yeah.
But they beat the Patriots twice. They beat the Jets. They beat the Panthers. They beat the Giants. Like, this is a who's who of the very worst teams in the NFL. I mean, they did beat the Chargers in Week 1. That's the one team they beat that was at 500 because they were 0-0. And they took care of business against the Raiders, who can be pesky. The Commanders are another pretty terrible team. So I just need to see them play better competition. And they're, unfortunately, I mean, look, the Titans, who knows? Then they have the Jets again. But then, Dallas, Baltimore, Buffalo is a very tough finish. The Bills are probably going to need that last game desperately. So we'll see. I'm not focused on the one seed. I still, want to, for me, the first thing is win the division. And if Miami can take care of business, they have a 3-game lead right now, although it's really 2 because Buffalo beat them the first time they played. They have a 3-game lead with 2 very winnable games coming up. So take care of business and, then worry about seeding after that. And I hope that they, as a team, have that kind of focus.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd agree with you there, Dave.
Yeah. So one fun fantasy question, I think probably the 2 best stacks, well, maybe there's 3 with Jalen Hurts and AJ Brown, but Dak and CD have just been on fire, like the last 5 weeks. And Tua and Tyreek have pretty much been putting up big points all year. They're 2 really good stacks to have. I have in my main league Tua and Tyreek, and it makes a big difference. Every time you get one of those long touchdowns, it's just like you see your score, you refresh it, and you just see a lot more points than you saw before that. Heading into the fantasy playoffs, which one of those stacks would you rather have on your team, or would you maybe look to focus on in DFS play?
Well, Dave, as a Cowboys fan, of course I want the Dak CD stack in all of my leagues. However, man, since you're making me pick one, Dave, I got to go with Tyreek and Tua. You look at Tyreek, he's on a record-setting pace right now, and I'd take Tyreek over any other receiver in the NFL right now. Just the way that those two have played together, and Tyreek and that McDaniel offense, the way that he's maximized Tyreek's skill set, it's hard not to go with that stack.
See, I'm gonna go the other way, and the reason is the schedule.
Okay.
Miami's playoff schedule, so that would start next week. They're home against the Jets, who are, I think, number 1 against wide receivers, number 4 against quarterbacks, and fewest fantasy points allowed. And Tyreek did get a touchdown in the first game, but he also got hurt in that game and was in and out of the lineup a little bit. Tua had his worst game of the season against the Jets. He threw that pick six, and then he threw that other pick as soon as they got the ball again, and he only had the one touchdown. And they have the Ravens the third week. So they have the Jets, the Cowboys, and the Ravens in the 3 weeks of the fantasy playoffs. And that's just, two of those teams are top 5 defenses against quarterbacks and receivers. And Dallas is not an easy defense. So only for that reason, I think, throughout the season, I would have rather had the Miami stack, and they've had an easier schedule. But for the playoffs, give me Dak and CD, and Dak's just looking for him all the time. So they both have very high target concentration, which is nice.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Dave, here we are. As we like to do every week, we like to do our top 10 power rankings and then our bottom 3 power outage rankings. Dave, start us off with your top 10, my friend.
All right. I'm assuming we're both going to have the same top team after what happened last week, but I've got the 49ers first. I have the Eagles second. I have the Ravens third, the Cowboys fourth, the Dolphins fifth, the Chiefs sixth, the Lions seventh, the Texans eighth. I got the Bills ninth, and I got the Jaguars 10th. And there's a little asterisk there because if Trevor Lawrence is going to miss multiple weeks,
yeah,
it's hard for me to kind of have the Jaguars in my top 10, but maybe he only misses one game. So, and I just think they had a bad game Monday night. They also lost Christian Kirk in that game, and he's going to be out for a while. So, they've been healthy. They've been pretty healthy this year, but they also recently lost their starting left tackle, Cam Robinson, I think 2 weeks ago. So they're a little backed up right now. My bottom 3, at the very bottom, Carolina, New England second from the bottom, and the Washington Commanders third from the bottom.
Okay.
What's your top 10 and bottom 3 right now, Paul?
All right, so number 1, San Francisco. Number 2, Philadelphia. Number 3, I have the Dallas Cowboys. Number 4, I have the Miami Dolphins. Number 5, Baltimore Ravens. Number 6, I have the Detroit Lions. Number 7, Kansas City. Number 8, the Houston Texans. Number 9, the Buffalo Bills. And then number 10, Dave, this might be the biggest shock of all. I have the Los Angeles Rams. I like what they're doing. I think they're starting to turn a corner. They've got a really good offense, and their defense has been solid all season. And then my bottom 3, number 1, the Panthers, number 2, the Patriots, and number 3, the Tennessee Titans.
All right. We have very similar lists. And I think, the best teams have started to separate themselves a little bit. And I think the worst teams, the same is true. So
absolutely,
I guess no huge surprises there. So we haven't done this yet this year, but, and I don't like to talk about who should win the MVP until pretty late in the season because it changes so much. And if you follow the betting markets on this, there's like 8 different players, I think. Maybe not 8, but there's more than 5 players who this year at one point have been the shortest odds for MVP. If the season ended today, who would you put your vote in for if you were an NFL writer who got to vote for such things?
All right, my QB MVP, man, this was really, really tough because it came down to Dak Prescott and C.J. Stroud. I gave the edge to C.J. Stroud simply because nobody expected anything from the Texans this year with that new coaching staff and that young team. And then just to see what C.J. Stroud is doing as a rookie, the records that he's setting, man, it's nothing short of impressive. So, yeah, he got the edge there just because of the situation there in Houston. And then my non-QB MVP, this is no shocker here, but Tyreek Hill. I mean, come on.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, my answer, and I kind of hate that this is such a QB award because was it Adrian Peterson was the last non-QB to win MVP, and that was more than.
I thought he got snubbed, or he had to co-share with somebody or something, right?
Maybe I have to go back and look, but it's basically become a quarterback award, and it's sort of goes to the quarterback on a team that either gets a bye or is a 2 seed almost every year. But honestly, I think this year, there are a couple quarterbacks that are arguably worthy. Certainly Brock Purdy, Dak Prescott, Hurts. Lamar Jackson, a little further down, Jackson, Mahomes, even Tua. There's a bunch of quarterbacks you could think about. But I would give it to Tyreek Hill. And honestly, my second choice would be Christian McCaffrey. I mean, I think those two guys have just been so important to their team's offenses. They maybe Raheem Mostert has more touchdowns than both of them, but they're both among the NFL leaders in touchdowns. They're both real difference makers. They both have a ton of yards on the season. And Tyreek, I mean, he's on pace for 2,000 yards. It's never been done before. And he tilts the defense. Miami does not have a great offensive line. I mean, they have a good scheme and they have, decent running backs, but like Tyreek makes room for everyone. Defenses are so worried about him, that it opens up a lot of stuff for the rest of the offense. And he's Tua's best friend. I mean, when you can just chuck it deep and you can't overthrow the guy, that's pretty huge. So I would give it to Tyreek, but that won't happen because it's not an award that they give to anyone other than quarterbacks. So
unfortunately, so
that's my rant for tonight. Don't just make it a QB award. I mean, I remember the year Ray Lewis won MVP one year. It should be an award that they think a little more broadly about. I know quarterback's the most important position in the game. But, look, I don't know if there'll be a quarterback that throws maybe Josh Allen. Josh Allen or Tua could be near 40 touchdowns. But this may be a year where no quarterback has 40 touchdown passes. It's possible.
Absolutely. All right, Dave, here we are with our performances of the week. Week 13, give me your Week 13 AFC and NFC performance of the week.
All right, my NFC performance of the week is Deebo Samuel. He just took over that game. Like, it looked like the Eagles either didn't want to tackle him or couldn't tackle him because, he just started, somewhere like midway through the second quarter, he just started, just destroying that defense every time he touched the ball. And, he scored 3 touchdowns. And he was the difference in that game. I mean, I just talked about McCaffrey, and part of the beauty of the 49ers is they have 4 different guys, 4 different skill position guys who can just kill you. Ayuk can do it, Kittle can do it, Deebo can do it, and McCaffrey can do it. And this week was Deebo's turn. That Philly defense, they're weak in the secondary, and they just attacked him with Deebo. So I'll give it to Deebo. That was an amazing performance, and I think he led all fantasy scorers, certainly all non-QBs this week. The AFC, I was tempted to give it to Tyreek Hill, but I'm going to give it to Jake Browning. 32 of 37 on the road in just his second start, 350 plus yards. He threw 1 touchdown, 1 interception. He ran 1 in, and he led his team to an overtime victory. So Deebo and Jake Browning for me. Who are yours for this week?
All right. So Dave, we haven't recorded in a while. I was a little bit rusty. And for some reason I looked at the show sheet and I had it as AFC or NFC, not both. However, thank goodness for the internet. Thank goodness for Sleeper. I do have one for each. NFC, I want to go with DK Metcalf, man. I mean, the way he came into Week 13 on the road and a playoff-like atmosphere, facing the hottest cornerback in the NFL, after an embarrassing loss on Thanksgiving to the 49ers, I mean, he just came in and he torched their top 5 defense. DK was incredible on Thursday night. And in the AFC, this was a guy that I was avoiding because I just had no idea what to expect with a new head coach and a rookie quarterback. But Michael Pittman, he's been nothing but solid all season. He has 11 receptions, goes for over 100 yards, and scores a game-winning touchdown in overtime to beat the Tennessee Titans and to just keep the Indianapolis Colts in the wild card conversation, the playoff conversation, and looks like they might even be competing with the for that division title there with the injury to Trevor Lawrence. Of course, we don't know how serious or unserious that injury might be, but the Michael Pittman's been having a great season.
Yeah, and the Colts have proven. We talked so much about quarterback injuries. They've proven that if you have a good backup, and they've got one of the one of the better, if not the best, backups in the league, a guy who's been successful, like over 500 as a starter in his career. it makes a huge difference. They lost Anthony Richardson, who was playing really well, and their season isn't over, and they've been without Jonathan Taylor 2 different times, and they've hung in there, and Minshew is a huge part of that. And a fun little stat that I saw the other day about Michael Pittman. So he now has 314 career receptions, and he's in his 4th season, and that's the Colts record for catches inside of a player's first 4 seasons.
Wow.
And the Colts have 2 guys who are in the top 10 all time in NFL receptions, in Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne, who both played their entire careers as Colts. And, in 12 games into his 4th season, Pittman has more catches than either of those guys had through their first 4 seasons. So that's pretty impressive. And especially because you look at like the revolving door they've had at quarterback, he's catching passes from Matt Ryan and Phillip Rivers and Carson Wentz and, whoever else they've had. Kobe Brissett at one point, like he's gotten a lot of receptions. So I like that answer. That's a good one.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Let's move to those are our players of the week, our duds of the week. And again, this is AFC and NFC, so hopefully you got 2 answers for me. Who are your and it could be a team, it could be a unit of a team, or it could be an individual player. Who are your duds of the week for this past week?
My NFC dud of the week is Derek Carr, man. I mean, when you're playing at home and the local fans are booing you, that's a problem. This Derek Carr has already seemed to have lost the locker room. He's lost the fan base. I feel bad for him because I think he's a good guy, and I've always thought that he was a better player. I just thought that maybe he was in a bad situation out there in Oakland, aka Las Vegas. But I don't know, man. I'm starting to question how good he actually really might be.
How about AFC?
AFC, come on, the New England Patriots coaching staff. You face the Los Angeles Chargers and you can't score a single point. My goodness, Chargers are one of the worst defenses in the league. I mean, you've benched Mac Jones 2 or 3 times this season. It's just a dumpster fire in New England, man. So AFC is New England Patriots coaching staff. How about you, Dave?
Well, I have the same one. I wrote down the Patriots offense, but that's fair. 0 points at home against a bad defense is just, that was beyond embarrassing. I'll give an honorable mention in the AFC to the Steelers, the whole team. The Cardinals are one of the 5 worst teams in the NFL. I mean, I know they beat the Cowboys earlier in the season. They've shown that they can show up, but it's not easy going into Pittsburgh. And they went in and beat them pretty easily. And it was a weird game. There were like 2 huge weather delays in that game. And the Steelers lost Kenny Pickett along the way. But come on, the Steelers needed that game. I mean, they're right in the thick of it. A win, they get to 8-4, and they're kind of in a commanding position for those wild card spots. And they can't get it done against, the Cardinals. That's a bad job by them. The NFC, I'm going to give it to the Eagles defense, who I mentioned already, but like they got stops. The first 2 49er possessions, they forced punts. And I was watching that game and I was thinking, all right, maybe they've fixed some things and they've come to play today. They're at home. The crowd's behind them. It's a huge game. It's a rematch of the NFC Conference Championship game, which, they won in part because San Francisco lost not 1, but 2 quarterbacks in that game. And then the next 7 49er possessions, 6 straight touchdowns, and then a kneel downs to end the game. Just a terrible job by the Eagles defense. They got embarrassed at home. Couldn't stop the 49ers, couldn't stop Deebo Samuel, but really couldn't stop anyone. So they're my dud of the week.
Like it. All right, what player team was the biggest Week 13 surprise, Dave?
I was just going to say, as a Cowboy fan, I'm sure you love hearing that. So my biggest surprise of the week, I'll stay right where I was the Arizona Cardinals just going into Pittsburgh and winning, fairly easily. And again, the Steelers needed the game. Nice little revenge game for James Conner going back into Pittsburgh. He scored 2 touchdowns and looked good in the process. So that was my biggest surprised. I didn't expect to see the Cardinals go in there, travel across country and into a hostile environment and beat a well-coached team like the Steelers.
Yeah.
What was your top surprise of the week?
I mean, it's got to be Jake Browning and the Bengals, right? I know I didn't expect the game to be close at all, let alone to go into overtime, and let alone for him to go head-to-head with Trevor Lawrence and win that game, man. Jake Browning was my biggest surprise.
That's a good one. Here's one of my favorite segments of the show because I like to put all these crazy stats in my weekly column also, so I research them. What was your favorite stat of the week from this past week?
Joe Flacco leading the NFL in air yards in Week 13, fresh off the couch, Dave.
Well, he's in that mile-high air, so the ball travels. Yeah, that was pretty incredible that he just, came off the couch. I'm assuming the Jets called him at some point, and he was like, you know what? No. But then with Cleveland, maybe it was more, they're a better team in the playoff hunt, and he thought that would be a good idea. For me, this isn't so much a statistic as a statistical oddity. So the Chargers were laying 5.5 points at New England. That was the line, the point spread. They scored 6 points only, and they covered. I can't imagine that that's ever happened in the history of the NFL, that a team was like giving, up to 10 points, scored, half a point more than what they were giving and still won the game. Kind of incredible that you could be laying 5.5, kick 2 field goals only, and the bettors who bet on you cash their tickets. So for me, that's the craziest stat of the week.
That is pretty crazy, man. That really is.
Can you imagine if you had money on the Chargers and you're given 5.5 and they're just sitting there on a 6-0 lead, and the Patriots getting the ball back? And kudos to the Patriots defense. I mean, my other crazy stat of the week is the Patriots in the last 3 games. You probably saw this stat because it was put up in a lot of places and it was all over Twitter, but in 3 straight games, they've held their opponents to 10 points or less and lost all 3 games. And that happened. A team has not done that since the 1938 Chicago Cardinals, who lost 4 games in a row where they held the opponent to 10 points or less. And that's in the dead ball era of football, where there was no forward passing basically. And they were playing on old grass fields where you couldn't run. So that's a pretty crazy stat too.
Yeah, it really is. It really is, man. So Dave, the 49ers absolutely destroyed the Eagles in Philly. After punting on their first 2 drives, they scored TDs on their next 6 possessions. Was this their revenge for the NFC title game, or are they that much better than Philadelphia?
I don't think they're that much better than Philadelphia. I think this is just kind of a game that got out of hand for whatever reason. That sometimes happens in the NFL. You'll just be watching and you'll be like, they just can't stop them. Every time they get the ball, they've solved something. The coaches after the game are going to go and look at the film and make adjustments. And then the next time they play, and I do think these teams will probably play again in the playoffs. It might not be the NFC title game, but in all likelihood, they'll face each other again. And, I think not that much separates these teams, but what does separate them is San Francisco is good on both sides of the ball. And right now, Philadelphia is hard to run on, but, their defense has given up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Is it quarterbacks or receivers? No, maybe it's receivers. And it's receivers. They've given up the most fantasy points to receivers and the most TD catches to receivers. And they've really had a problem all year, and this was the 5th straight game that they were trailing at halftime, and it finally caught up with them. But, you can't keep coming back. That's not how football works. Credit to Hurts and the offense for coming back in those other games. But I think San Francisco's better. I don't think they're, 25 to 30 points better.
Yeah.
And I do think it was a bit of a, nice revenge for them, saying sort of like, see, if we have our quarterback, we can beat you guys.
Right.
Yeah. What did you take away from it?
I just took away from it, two teams going head to head, and we see it. Sometimes that really good team, man. I mean, arguably the best team in the NFL just had an off week, and they went up against another juggernaut in the NFL, and that they just had a bad day. And I mean, credit to Philadelphia, they still put up what I believe it was 19 points. I know that's not a lot, but they kind of stayed locked in. They didn't throw in the towel by any means or rest their starters after they got up. They were down by 20 points. They kept fighting, but yeah, I don't think, like you said, I don't think San Francisco is 20 points better, 30 points better than Philadelphia. But when you think about how Philadelphia has had to come back so many times, like you mentioned, I do think San Francisco might actually be the better team.
Yeah, I think so too. So another one of the most consequential games of the week was that Sunday night game with, the Chiefs going into Green Bay, the Packers taking care of business, beating them not super convincingly. I mean, the game came down to some, questionable refereeing at the end, and the Chiefs had a chance there at the end with, usually you put the ball in Mahomes' hands, and if you're a Packer fan there, I think that was like tight underwear, wet diaper moment. They came away with the win. Got the big no call when MVS was mugged. But this was a big game. It put the Packers at 6-6, and now they're right in the thick of it with three other teams that are 6-6 fighting for the wild card. Knocked the Chiefs back a game behind the Dolphins and the Ravens for that one seed. What are your thoughts on these two teams right now, on both the Packers and the Chiefs coming off of this big game?
Yeah, I think Jordan Love, Christian Watson, and the Packers offense are getting hot at the right time. I know Watson is kind of dealing with an injury. Maybe he's banged up. I'm not sure how serious it is. I guess we'll find out. But I like what we've seen from the Packers and Jordan Love kind of starting to find his groove with the offense, and him and Christian Watson working on that connection. And that's big for that Packers offense. And with the Chiefs, they still have some things to figure out on offense. If they want to make another Super Bowl run, it's kind of how I feel about the Chiefs. Their defense has really saved them this season. It's a shame what's become of that offense.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think KC will ultimately be fine. They're just so well coached, and they have Patrick Mahomes, and they have a solid defense.
Yeah.
And he hasn't been as dominant this year, but they have Travis Kelce. Isaiah Pacheco, man, that guy runs as hard as anyone in the NFL. I like watching him. He just like takes on defenders and punishes them. And he's really been the best player on their offense, the last few. So I think Green Bay will be fine, but their offense is Kansas City will be fine, but their offense is definitely not what we expected and sputtering a decent amount. Green Bay is dangerous. Here's another crazy stat.
Yeah.
Matt LaFleur, as their coach, has never lost a game in December. He's 16-0. So you could kind of expect them to play well at the end of the season because they've done it every year, that he's been coaching there. And, Jordan Love is really it's been like a roller coaster season for him. He started out hot, then he swooned for a couple games. Now he's really playing well again. I do think Christian Watson, he injured the same hamstring that cost him some games earlier in the season. And that just seems to be like a nagging problem that they're going to need to see a specialist or something this off season to figure out what's going on with that. But I expect he's going to be out for at least one game and maybe more, just based on how it looked when he went down, and the fact that it's the same hamstring. So, and they do need him. This week they play the Giants at the Giants, which is a game they should win, and they need to win, to get to 7-6, which, they kind of every game is really important now for these 6-6 and 7-5 teams. That could be a little bit of a tricky game for them. I mean, I think they should be able to handle the Giants, but the Giants have been making teams turn the ball over a lot the last couple games. They've won 2 in a row. They're coming off a bye. Packers coming off a huge win, could have a little bit of a letdown. So I think that's actually one of the more under the radar interesting games this coming week, and we'll preview the week in a minute. But anyway, I thought that was a huge win for Green Bay, and sets them up for a good run to get into the playoffs.
Absolutely. And like the Packers, another team that's ascending is the Rams. They handled the Browns at home. And assuming one of Dallas or Philly is the 5 seed, Dave, it looks like the Rams, Vikings, Packers, and Seahawks, who are all now 6-6, are fighting for 2 spots. Who gets them?
So I went ahead, I looked at the schedules for all of them. And the Packers, I would say, have probably by a lot the easiest remaining schedule of those 4 teams. They're at the Giants, as I said. Then they're home against the Bucks. Then they're at the Panthers, at the Vikings, and then home for the Bears, the last game of the season. So I think it's going to be pretty easy for them to go 3-2, and they could even go 4-1. And I think a winning record will probably get that last seed. So I like them. The other ones, I like the Rams for all the reasons you said, but they've got to play at Baltimore and at San Francisco among their 5 remaining games. 2 of the best teams in the NFL. The other 3 are all winnable. They've beaten the Seahawks twice. So if they end up in just a tie with them, that's a nice tiebreaker to have. But it probably won't matter because there are going to be more teams involved. The Seahawks' next 2 games are at San Francisco and then home against Philadelphia. Obviously, that's also like a really tough schedule, but I liked what I saw out of them against Dallas. They've been there before. They're very well coached with Pete Carroll. Maybe Geno's getting hot. They'll probably lose to San Francisco, but I wouldn't be shocked if they beat Philly at home. So I'm going to say the Packers and the Seahawks, and I'm writing off the Vikings. Who do you like out of those 4? Which 2?
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add to that, Dave. Of these 4 teams, I think the Rams and Seahawks are the best teams. That being said, because of the way they're playing right now, I think the Rams and Packers are the teams that will earn the final 2 wildcard spots.
Yep. It's going to be interesting to watch. The wild cards in both conferences are going to be very competitive, with
definitely
with a couple teams missing that are probably better than some of the teams that'll get them. So we'll see what happens. Over in the AFC, talking about wild cards, the Jaguars loss coupled with the Texans and the Colts winning, and all of a sudden the AFC South is close. You got an 8-4 team and 2 7-5 teams. I feel like all season we've been looking at the AFC North and saying, could they have 4 playoff teams?
Yeah.
Expecting that no matter what, they were going to have 3. But, is it the craziest thing you've ever heard? And I know this would have sounded completely insane at the start of the season, but could the AFC South actually have 3 playoff teams this year?
Really, David, it all depends on how much time Trevor Lawrence misses, if at all. But from what I've heard, he's dealing with a high ankle sprain, and sprains take time to heal, man. So if he were to miss 3 games, I don't see the Jaguars making the playoffs or winning any of those games.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the AFC South may only get 1 team in, but and I like the Texans to win that division now.
Yeah.
But we'll see. There'd be a fun team. I hope they get in one way or the other.
I wouldn't hate it if the Colts also made it. I like they're good. They're an easy team to root for. They've got some exciting pieces too.
I agree.
So Dave, the NFC South once again has no teams over 500. Late in the season, Atlanta at 6-6 is 1 game up on 5-7 New Orleans and Tampa Bay. Who takes this division?
So I'm going to say the Saints. And I know they're a game back right now, but I continue to think, and I also know that they don't have their quarterback right now, but they have a capable backup in Jameis Winston, and frankly, they have Taysom Hill also, who's like their red zone quarterback. He's playing well. They have an easy schedule. Their last 5 are the Panthers, Giants, Rams, Bucks, and they get the Falcons at home the last game of the season, which easily could be the game that decides the division, and they'll be home for that. So I'm going to say the Saints. They've been my pick all year to win that division. How about you? Who do you like there?
Of these four teams, the Falcons have the easiest remaining schedule. 3 of their last 4 games are versus division opponents. So I like the Falcons to win this god-awful division.
Okay. And then whoever wins it is going to get annihilated by either the Cowboys or the Eagles. So
Exactly.
just like what happened last year, with the Bucks and the Cowboys. But
right.
Well, that's the one kind of what's the word the consolation prize for whoever doesn't win the NFC East is at least their first playoff game will probably be against a weak team from the NFC South.
Yeah, true. So, Dave, looking at the Thursday night game here, let's talk a little bit about this Thursday night matchup. The 7-5 Steelers versus the 2-10 Patriots. It's Mitch Trubisky versus Bailey Zappi. The over-under is a whopping 30 points, which is the lowest in the NFL this season. Pats fans are rooting for a top 2 pick and are happy to keep losing. Is anyone watching this game besides the fans of both of these teams?
No, and I'll spend less than a minute on this. The only people watching are gamblers, people playing fantasy football who, this is the last week before the playoffs and they might need, believe it or not, they might need a touchdown from Ezekiel Elliott, the new starting running back,
the ghost
for the Patriots, and then fans of the teams, and that's it. I mean, find something else to do tomorrow night. Now watch, it'll be a great game, but
exactly, yeah.
It's Belichick and Tomlin, so that's kind of interesting,
Yeah.
2 coaches that have won a lot of Super Bowls, but I don't think anyone else is watching this. And honestly, I don't think we need to say too much more about this game, but I'll just ask you the fun question that's on everyone's mind. Where do you think Bill Belichick is going to be next year? Where do you think he'll be coaching?
All right, Dave. You're going to think I'm crazy, but here we go. AFC, I think it'll be the New York Jets. NFC, give me the Carolina Panthers. And then my wild card team, the Atlanta Falcons.
So the Jets, I mean, he agreed to coach the Jets 25 years ago and then left them at the altar. There was a press conference and then the Jets had basically, announced that he was going to be their coach. And he ended up, I forget all the details of it, but he obviously ended up going to the Patriots instead. I will eat my hat if he's the head coach. I just can't see that happening. But it would be the funniest story, in history. It would be so Jets, they couldn't.
Oh yeah.
And now they get him now when maybe he's not quite the coach he used to be. I honestly think he'll be in New England.
Okay.
I don't think he wants to.
Probably so.
But we'll see. We'll see.
All right, Dave, just for fun, predict a final score for this game.
Pittsburgh 20, New England 7. How about you?
Okay.
What's your prediction for this game?
My prediction for this game, it's 2-6. All points are scored via safeties.
Nice. Well, that could actually happen. All right, so let's we'll wrap the show up like we always do, looking ahead at week 14. So I think I could guess your answer to this. We'll see what you have to say. Which game is your game of the week?
The easy answer is Dallas, Philly, Dave, but the Chiefs and Bills are always a good matchup. So, that's where I put my money on.
Wow, we have the same answer. So my answer, look, Philly at Dallas is a huge game.
Yeah.
Philly's down to a 1-game lead over Dallas. They barely held off the Cowboys when they played in Philadelphia. With the way Dallas's offense is playing and the way Philly's defense is playing, this could be a very tall order for Philly to not give up, too many points that their offense can't make up. But I wrote down Buffalo at Kansas City. This is a game the Bills have to have.
Yes.
Coming off a bye, Kansas City is coming off a disappointing loss in prime time, and they need to get back on track. They don't want to fall to where they might only be a game ahead of the Broncos, which probably won't be. I don't think they really have to worry about the division, but they do have to worry about their playoff seeding, and they do have to worry about the way they're playing. And I think, Buffalo has to have this game. It's a rematch of the 13-second game in the playoffs that went to overtime a couple of years ago. So that's mine. That's also my game of the week.
Well, Dave, on the other side of the stud, you have to have a dud. Which game is your dud of the week?
So my dud game of the week, which on paper a couple weeks ago probably looked like a really good game, is Jacksonville at Cleveland. I think it's an interesting game, but I'm assuming Trevor Lawrence won't be playing in this game, and so it's going to be like if it's either DTR or Joe Flacco again. CJ Beathard for Jacksonville, and the forecast, there's like a 92% chance of rain and 40 degrees. So you might remember last year there were a bunch of games in Cleveland. They had like the worst weather all year. And they had some really bad games where, like, I think there was that game, I forget who it was against, that, really low scoring, tons of turnovers. And I think this could just be a hard game to watch. So that's my even though it's a very important game for playoff seeding, and it's a game that is interesting and people should pay attention to, I just think it's going to be a bad game. What do you think?
Yeah, Dave, the Jaguars and Browns with their backup quarterbacks have the makings of the perfect time to run errands and or take a nap before the real games start.
There you go. This one, you're always good with these, Paul. What's your sneaky shootout game of the week?
Yeah, I don't know how sneaky this one is, Dave, but the Rams and Ravens game is a very intriguing game to me and should be a high-scoring affair.
Yeah, I wrote down for this the Lions at the Bears, which I don't think is that sneaky, because neither of the teams has a good defense. When they played a couple weeks ago and Detroit won that crazy comeback, there were a lot of points scored in that game. The Bears have been playing better on both sides of the ball. The Lions have been struggling on defense, but the Lions offense is cooking. They got a lot of weapons on that offense. Jared Goff's playing well. So that's my sneaky shootout of the week for this week.
I think Montez Sweat, man, he's really started to kind of make his presence felt there.
Yeah, that was a good ad for them.
Yeah. It really was. Which team has the biggest chance of pulling off an upset this week, Dave?
So I looked at all the betting lines this week, and I think the underdog I like the most is the Raiders, getting 3 at home against the Vikings.
Yeah.
The Vikings are coming off a bye. They should have Justin Jefferson back. I saw that he practiced in full today, and that's a good sign. He was apparently, pretty close to being able to return before the bye, but I think they wisely said, you know what, we'll give him 2 more weeks instead of 1 more week. Josh Dobbs should hopefully rebound from that atrocious game he had before the bye. But, the Raiders have played a lot of teams tough this year. Their defense is better than you think. Aiden O'Connell is playing pretty well. They're coming off a bye. I mean, both teams are. But I think they may pull this one out. They have the better kicker. I think it maybe comes down to that. Both of these teams have played a ton of one-score, really close games in the last 2 years. Like other than the Chargers, the Raiders and Vikings have probably been involved in more like comes down to the last possession and the field goal kicker kind of game. And I'll put my money on Carlson over Joseph. So I'll take the Raiders, and I really like them with the 3 points. How about for you?
Yeah, I like the Rams' chances of pulling off an upset this week, Dave, with that offense. The addition of bringing back Kyron Williams and Ravens coming off a bye week. Maybe they kind of stumble a little bit against that offense and are a bit rusty. So I picked the Rams to pull off the upset this week.
All right, I like it. I would love, as a Dolphin fan, I'd love it actually. So I'm pulling for the Rams. All right, so I mentioned a couple times during the show that the fantasy playoffs are a week away. So if you're desperate for a win, you've been riding certain players all year, but you got to play the matchups also. If you're desperate for a win and assuming Trevor Lawrence doesn't play, are you trusting any Jaguars this week against a Cleveland defense that earlier in the year was absolutely suffocating? They've they've given it up
Yeah.
in the last couple of weeks. I mean, the Broncos and the Rams both had pretty good offensive games against this defense in the last 2 weeks, but those were on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And they're home for this one. Maybe they get Denzel Ward back, who's a big piece of their secondary. Are you trusting any Jaguars in this game?
I want to say Travis Etienne, but I hate this matchup, so I'll have to say no. But he's somebody I would, in a pinch, I would start Etienne just because of a volume play. We saw what Kyron Williams was able to do.
Yeah, I think if you have ETN, you're starting him. I mean, you've been riding him all year, and he's among the league leaders in rushing touchdowns. And especially, if they're starting CJ Beathard, they're probably trying to run the ball a lot.
Yeah.
And might have some success doing that. I'd be careful with Calvin Ridley and Evan Ingram, though, and especially if it's a crappy weather day. This could be a game with very little passing yardage if the weather's bad, and the Jaguars going with a backup quarterback, plus they're without Christian Kirk, who's kind of their speed guy.
Mm-hmm.
I could just see guys not being open.
Yeah.
And Beathard having nowhere to go with the ball. So, I mean, that's unfortunate if you need, if you needed Trevor Lawrence or if you need ETN or Ridley this week, but, you got to in most cases, you might not have a better option. So, I mean, obviously, you have another quarterback. You can't play a guy who's hurt, but, a lot of people might just have to play ETN. I think most people would play regardless, but might have to play Ingram and Ridley because they don't have better options.
True, very true. So they have a couple of other highly productive offenses for fantasy, have very tough matchups that could impact start-sit decisions. How are you feeling about starting your Rams at Baltimore? Looking at the Baltimore's defense, the NFL's number one ranked defense and top 5 in fewest fantasy points allowed to quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And then on the Texans players at the Jets, who have allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks and the fewest, 3 receiving TDs all year to wide receivers. How are you feeling about those matchups?
I'll start with the second one, which is the Jets. I'm not looking to start CJ Stroud this week, as good as he's been. I mean, and if you have him, you probably don't have that much of a choice. But you look at the quarterbacks the Jets have played this year. So you mentioned that they've allowed the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers and the 4th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. They've played all the good quarterbacks. They played Josh Allen, Mahomes, Hurts, Dak, Tua, Herbert. And their offense can't stay on the field. So not only have they played those quarterbacks have had plenty of chances to put up on them. And for the most part, they've I told you, Tua had his worst game of the season against them. Hurts had one of his worst. Josh Allen, week 1, had probably his worst game of the season against the Jets. So I'm nervous about CJ Stroud in this spot. I mean, the Texans will win the game, but like most Jet games, they'll win by a low score. Zach Wilson's going to be starting again, which he's better than Tim Boyle, but
I gotta hope.
I'm nervous about Stroud this week. You probably don't have a better option. I would start Nico Collins just with Tank Dell out. Collins is just getting so much volume. And for the Rams, obviously you're starting Kyron Williams. I would be careful with Matt Stafford this week. If you've been riding him, he's been great the last 2 weeks. I think he has like 24 fantasy points 2 weeks in a row or somewhere around there. I'd be careful against the Ravens. I'd try to start someone else. I would start Puka Nacua and I would start Kyron Williams for sure. But I probably would try not to start Cooper Kupp. Higbee's, I think, hurt, and he's not a very good, play usually anyway. How about you? It's do or die week for a lot of people. So
right.
A lot of tough start-sit decisions. Anything? You have any different thoughts about either of these two offenses going up against tough defenses?
I mean, you mentioned it's do or die, Dave, and I've already, said that I think the Ravens and Rams is going to be a sneaky shootout. So I think this will be a high-scoring game, and I'm starting every Rams and Ravens player I have. As far as the Texans and the Jets, I think you said it perfectly. It's hard to trust Stroud when you look at what the Jets have done to opposing offenses and quarterbacks in fantasy. Nico Collins, I mean, just strictly based off volume, I think he's a must-start. But yeah, you definitely aren't probably starting any Jets offensive player, so that's a pretty easy decision there. And yeah, man, I don't know. It's CJ Stroud has been so good. It's hard to justify sitting him, but man, when you look at what the Jets have done, it's hard to justify starting him too.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that about the Jets, and I think people who have Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, you kind of have to start them. But the Jets only have one offensive touchdown in their last 5 games. I mean, it's been that bad. Now, maybe with
Yeah.
Zach Wilson back under center, they at least have a chance of scoring some touchdowns. But it's even worse than that. I think they have 2 offensive touchdowns in their last 6 games. So they really just have stopped scoring entirely. Greg Zuerlein has been their leading scorer. Here's another crazy stat that this could have been my favorite stat of the week. The Jets have more safeties in the first quarter of games this year than offensive touchdowns.
Oh my goodness,
Yeah,
that's insane.
they have 2 first quarter safeties. They got another one this past week, and they have 1 first quarter touchdown on the entire season. So we don't need to dwell on the Jets because it's too depressing. But we'll get to your team now. Philly at Dallas could be like one of the all-time fantasy bonanzas. The over/under's 53. How worried should you be if you don't have a piece of this game and you're playing someone who has like a couple of pieces in this game?
With all the good matchups this week, I wouldn't feel too bad. I mean, but having players in this game would be a lot cooler than not having players in this game. But there, you look at the Chiefs and Bills, that's going to be a good game. I've already, talked about the Ravens and Baltimore. You look at the Lions and the Bears. I mean, there's some games with a lot of high scoring potential. So I wouldn't feel that bad about it, to be honest. How about you?
Well, the 3 games you mentioned in my main league, I don't have anyone in any of those 3 games, so I'm feeling pretty bad about it.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't. I have a good team, but I don't have pieces of those offenses, so I'm a little worried about this week in general.
All right, Dave. So here we are with our weekly, kind of your start sit, if you want to call it that. More so recommendations, if you will. But which highly ranked player is your fade of the week in fantasy?
I'll go with Bijan Robinson against Tampa this week. He's just been so hard to trust. He had a couple good games, then fell off again last week. He's the RB. He's ranked as the running back 5 this week, and I just think that's a little too high for him. They are using 3 running backs. Tampa has been a pretty stout run defense for most of the season. Not as good as they were last year. Like last year, you couldn't run on them at all. But, they still have like Vita Vea clogging the middle. Maybe they get some of those linebackers. They were without Levante David and what's his name? Their other name is escaping me, but their other star linebacker last week. But I'll fade Bijan this week. I mean, if you have him, you're starting him. But I'm not feeling it this week for him. How about you?
Well, even though he's been better as of late, I don't trust the unpredictable Arthur Smith against the Tampa Bay run defense. That's allowed just a little over 1,000 rushing yards all season and only 6 touchdowns to running backs all season. Bijan Robinson is also my fade of the week, Dave.
All right, so we finally, for those listening and watching, we say this every week. Paul and I do not share our answers for the show, so we ask a lot of questions on this show. So it's a guarantee that at some point we'll great minds will think alike, and we'll have the same answer. So let's sort of switch gears. Which lower ranked player is your sleeper of the week in fantasy this week?
All right, Mr. Brandon Cooks, currently the wide receiver 26 in the rankings. From weeks 9 through 13, Cooks has been the wide receiver 13, averaging 15 points per game and scoring 3 touchdowns during that span. He's also averaging 5 receptions per game. I like Cooks as a ceiling play in what will be a shootout this week. Dave, how about you?
I got nothing to add because my fade was Bijan, my ride was Brandon Cooks, and you said it perfectly. I had all those stats written down. Also, that Philly defense has been bad, and Cooks
Yeah.
has been coming on, and he's my pick as well.
All right, Dave, who will be the highest scoring player of the week?
Jalen Hurts.
Mm.
The Eagles came out the other day and said something weird like, "Oh yeah, he hurt his knee in week 6 against the Jets, and he really hasn't been 100%." And he certainly hasn't looked it. I just think that this is going to be a high scoring game. I think both teams are going to score a lot of points, and because he gets rushing touchdowns the way he does, I could just see Dallas winning the game, but Hurts having four or five total touchdowns, and especially if DeAndre Swift is a little bit banged up, I just think that that this is going to be a big Jalen Hurts game. Who's your high scorer of the week?
Yeah, Dave. So my highest scoring player of the week, fresh off of a bye week and playing in what is a must-win type of game. We've seen Buffalo and Kansas City play in major shootouts before. Josh Allen will be the highest scoring player of the week.
All right, so you and I picked the two highest scoring players of the year. So not going out on a limb, pretty chalky, but chalky answers are okay.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll both have chalky answers to this next question because I know I do. Who will be your highest scoring non-quarterback of the week?
Well, David, was between Tyreek and CMC, but I don't see the Dolphins and Titans game being very close or competitive. So Tyreek might not play very much in the second half. And I can see the 49ers and Seahawks playing in a close game. So Christian McCaffrey, RB1.
Yep, he's mine also. So we've really been aligned on the fantasy stuff here. And again, these are pretty chalky calls, but I sort of feel like last week was the Debo week. And this week we'll be reminded that, when they want it to, the offense can just run through Christian McCaffrey, and a defense like Seattle's going to have trouble keeping up with him and stopping him.
Yeah.
He's mine. He's mine as well.
All right, Dave, here we are with our bold call of the week. We have week 14. Give us your bold call week 14 edition, sir.
So I don't know how bold this is, but my bold call of the week is not only will the Bills beat the Chiefs, but they'll do so by at least 2 touchdowns, or right around by 2 touchdowns. I think they're gonna. I think they need this game, and you don't usually see Kansas City on the lopsided end of a loss, but I think the Bills are going to play their best game of the season, coming off a bye. The Chiefs are not playing their best football, and I think Bills by a score of something in the range of, I don't know, 35-21, something like that. What's your bold call of the week?
All right, my bold call, week 14 edition. The Denver Broncos beat the Los Angeles Chargers, and Brandon Staley gets fired.
I could see it. And then they hire Bill Belichick.
Wouldn't that be crazy? Somebody talked about that a while ago, that being a fit, Belichick with the Chargers.
I think it was me on this show. I mean, I've said that a few times to anyone who will listen. I mean, I think it's a pretty, I think that Belichick is going to want to go somewhere where there's a quarterback in place.
Yeah.
And not where there isn't a quarterback in place. And kind of a long-term thing too. And the Chargers have a lot of talent on that roster. It's an expensive roster. They have a lot of expensive veterans. Guys like Khalil Mack and Keenan Allen and Bosa. They've paid a lot of money to some guys, but I think it just could be a good fit because the structure's there and the quarterback's in place. But we'll see. I sort of at this point I mean, I know, he's coached in other places, but I sort of can't picture him on any sideline other than New England's. But stranger things have happened. So we'll see. This should be a really fun week of NFL action. It's been great talking about it. So we should
December football, baby.
We should probably give our Twitter handles and let everyone go to bed. Paul, where can people find you?
Yes, guys, I'm Paul Ryan. You can find me on Twitter at Paul_Ryan15. Dave, how about you?
At PigskinPapers, both of the P's are capitalized, and my website, thepigskinpapers.com. Enjoy the football this weekend, everyone.
Yes, thanks, guys, for joining us, and we will see you all next week.